Welcome back, everyone. And now we're ready for our final session, session 6, which is a panel discussion, participant reactions, and recommendations for the path forward. And we often view this panel as helping to design the roadmap for where we go from here. So thank you all for participating. Our moderator today is my fellow National Cancer Policy Forum member, Lisa Kennedy Sheldon. She is the Clinical and Scientific Affairs Liaison at the Oncology Nursing Society, ONS. She connects ONS members in the oncology nursing profession with professional organizations, advocates, and policymakers to support oncology nurses, advanced practice nurses, and researchers, and develops leaders to transform cancer care. She's made so many contributions in so many ways. So thank you very much, Lisa, and I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Larry. And thank you for the opportunity to lead this session. As you all know, we're very fortunate to be partnering with the Forum for Cyber Resilience on this workshop called The Opportunities and Challenges in Using Digital Health Applications in Oncology. We've mentioned before, the National Cancer Policy Forum serves as a trusted venue for experts in identifying emerging high-priority policy issues in cancer care. And I can't think of a more quickly emerging policy issue right now than digital technologies and their application to cancer care during the pandemic. We're very fortunate to have Larry Shulman, as well as Fred Schneider, as the chair of the Forum on Cyber Resilience, hosting this meeting, and I appreciate their work and the work of the Planning Committee. Over the last 5 sessions, we've talked about a lot of different novel digital health technologies with an emphasis on patient-facing applications, but including clinician-facing applications. We talked about regulatory, ethical, security, governance, and payment considerations, and the opportunities to improve data availability and interoperability, and use in EHRs, deciding on outcomes and metrics, and informing policy and practice improvement. I've been struck by some of the speakers and what they brought forward in this meeting today. I think starting out with these key policy issues, but moving into how do we trust software development in the digital application space in healthcare and in oncology? How do we review it and regulate it? What are the sources of approval? And what are the patient-facing perspectives, like we heard from Dave Dubin at Alive and Kicking and Andrea Downing from the Light Collective? If we're going to be monitoring patients, say for PROs that Ethan Bash discovered, how are we going to make sure that we nudge our patients to report these reported outcomes, these symptoms that we are obviously underreporting and that can impact not just quality of life, but survival? How do we establish trust in the community? What sort of cooperative models can we develop, as Khadija Ferriman talked about yesterday, that we can't just make a model and assume that we have had all of the right stakeholders involved in developing the technology? We've spanned both the precision and the personalized care and talked about how pooled data can inform the individual experience and personalize the digital applications for the patients using them. We've talked about the issues of billing and payment. We've talked about inconsistency in reimbursement and how that's going to impact care. We've seen how a data refinery such as Citizen can actually be mediated by patients to collect their information and match patients with clinical trials. We've had a lot of discussions about how we develop the digital health applications, and certainly this has been accelerated in real time over the last 4 months. Our speakers in the panel are going to talk about all of these issues and help us find a path forward. As I said, one of the most quickly evolving areas of policy that I've seen in my 4 years working on the National Cancer Policy Forum. Our first speaker today is Elisabeth Belmont. She serves as the corporate counsel for MaineHealth, an integrated healthcare delivery network. Ms. Belmont has participated in a number of national initiatives where quality improvement, patient safety, information technology intersect, including events sponsored by the DHHS Office of National Coordinator and Inspector Generals, the American Health Lawyers Association, and the American Society of Risk Management. We are fortunate to have Ms. Belmont on today to discuss the medical malpractice considerations and risk mitigation strategies in implementing digital health applications. Welcome, Elisabeth.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. While digital health technologies offer a myriad of benefits, they are not without risk. As in-house counsel to an integrated delivery system, one of my roles is to focus on medical malpractice risks. To illustrate how digital innovation in the healthcare sector can raise potential medical malpractice exposure, I thought that it may be helpful to use a consumer-based mobile telemetry application as an example. In the brief time allotted, I can touch on only 3 issues, so I have included a detailed outline in the briefing materials which identifies potential areas of medical malpractice exposure as well as risk mitigation strategies for your consideration. It is important to note that the digital health market is blurring the lines between what typically is viewed as medical grade and consumer digital health technology. This raises questions about the extent to which both patients and clinicians can rely upon consumer grade technologies, particularly when they have not been cleared or approved by the Food and Drug Administration. An effective means of managing a health provider's potential malpractice exposure is through the use of a consent form or patient agreement, which identifies the limitations and risks in using the technology, as well as certain requirements imposed by the clinician to optimize the chances of receiving reliable telemetry data. I have included an example of a patient agreement for use of mobile telemetry applications in Exhibit A of your materials. Either the consent form or patient agreement should be included in the patient's electronic health record. One area of potential risk involves limitations in the recording quality and automatic interpretation of mobile telemetry data. For example, the strip may have artifact or may not have been used in accordance with the vendor's instructions, which can affect the quality, accuracy, and reliability of the telemetry strip, and therefore its interpretation. To mitigate this risk, a provider should determine whether the recording quality of the telemetry data is sufficient to render a definitive diagnosis and implement a treatment plan, or whether a repeat electrocardiogram using either a Holter monitor or ECG machine is required. Another consideration is the fact that patient data, either generated or collected by a digital health application, typically is not included in the patient's electronic health record. Providers will need to develop a workflow for telemetry strips to be incorporated into the patient's record if they plan to rely upon this information for diagnosis and treatment purposes. Additionally, patient symptoms at the time the mobile telemetry application is triggered should be recorded within the application if such functionality is available, or noted separately by the patient and communicated to the provider. Digital technologies enabled by artificial intelligence can provide more precise, efficient, and impactful patient interventions. However, they also can pose a potentially greater risk to patients, since an error can be replicated across a greater number of patients than that of a human clinician error in judgment. It currently is unclear whether or not a healthcare provider has a duty to disclose the risks of AI-enabled technologies and alternatives to the patient. For example, there could be a risk of bias from the particular data and/or the manner in which the AI-enabled technology was developed, because the data used to train the system may not be sufficiently diverse or may have unique characteristics. While such bias may be unintentional, it still presents an important source of risk when AI-enabled technologies are used later with other populations. As the use of emerging technologies becomes more common, the standard of care in medical malpractice actions likely will undergo change, because certain technologies, such as an AI-enabled diagnostic tool, may supplant rather than augment a physician's professional judgment or function. The traditional malpractice standard of negligence may become more difficult to apply since AI algorithms can change in unexpected ways, making it difficult to apply traditional legal concepts of foreseeable harm and human causation. Moreover, it may be impossible to replicate the negative result because AI-enabled technology has learned and changed. In determining legal liability, it presently is unclear whether the use of new digital health technologies in patient care that results in injury to a patient will be evaluated under the traditional negligence standard applied in medical malpractice claims or by the product liability doctrine. Courts likely will use the existing legal framework and first determine if the emerging technology is a medical device or a medical service or procedure. Historically, hardware-based medical devices have been regulated by the FDA, while the practice of medicine has been regulated by state law. With the advent of software as a medical device that is intended to be used for one or more medical purposes without being part of a hardware-based medical device, this regulatory distinction has become blurred. In closing, it is important to consider risk mitigation strategies in implementing digital health technologies. Lisa?
Thank you, Elisabeth. That's certainly a lot to think about and new dimensions in law that we're going to have to not only react to, but develop over time. I'm going to move on to our next speaker now, is Paul Kluetz from the FDA. Paul is a medical oncologist and deputy director of the Oncology Center of Excellence at the US FDA. His interests include clinical trial design and endpoint selection to expedite drug development and define clinical benefit in oncology trials. Dr. Kluetz remains clinically active, caring for patients and supervising medical residents at the Georgetown University Hospital. Good morning, Dr. Kluetz.
Hi, Lisa.
Good morning.
Thank you guys so much for having me participate in this important discussion. And it's a discussion surrounding a topic that's close to my interests. Again, my name is Paul Kluetz. I'm a medical oncologist. In the Oncology Center, I've stood up a patient-focused drug development program, and more than just patient-reported outcomes and sensors, patient-focused drug development includes making trials more efficient, and it includes getting trials out to where patients live. And I think a lot of these technologies we talked about are kind of getting at that. I was struck by Dr. Cass yesterday. I was able to go through all the talks, and she was talking about ethical issues and that really we needed to understand what the purpose is of each stakeholder for the use of the DHT or the digital health technology. Now, as a regulator, I have an interest in really identifying specific information that affects the risks and benefits of the therapy that we're regulating, and that may be different from clinical care and that may be different from payers. But my hope is that by having workshops like this where all those stakeholders are together at this time, we should be able to find ways to make these learning healthcare systems applicable to all those stakeholders and find at least a minimal core aspect of some of these outcomes that can be used by all of us. So if you integrate an electronic PRO system in your clinical care, as Dr. Bosch or Dr. Pusick did, should we, I think we should, deploy tools that are used in clinical trials that therefore the regulators are familiar with. For instance, the Pro-CTCAE would be one example from the National Cancer Institute for symptom monitoring. So what aspects of digital health do I think is important as a regulator? I mentioned outcomes. We're very interested in clinical outcomes. We haven't done a very good job in clinical trials of quantifying rigorously symptom and functional outcomes. I think there's an opportunity there, both for symptomatic adverse events, as Stephen has discussed, but also physical function, ability to take care of yourselves. These are constantly coming across in our patient-focused drug development meetings as critically important to patients, and when they make a preference-based decision about whether and what therapy to go on to. As I mentioned, I'm also interested in how can we make clinical trials more efficient, more patient-friendly. A lot of the technologies that we heard about yesterday and today are about remote assessment. And that is all about how we can decentralize clinical trials. So can we use telehealth? Can we obtain clinical outcomes electronically from where patients live? So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Another issue I've heard that is very important is the use of real-world data or aggregated data sources. And I want to just mention, on top of Dr. Abernathy and Dr. Shaw, who have also touched on this, that we've been pretty proactive in collaborating with the real-world data purveyors, all the larger companies. We're very interested in identifying ways that we can use this data. And I think this evidence accelerator project that Dr. Abernathy is intimately involved in is a great example of one of the huge benefits, which is the rapidity, how rapid you can get some answers to characterize something very new and novel that's occurring, in this case, COVID-19. I did want to give a shout out to my colleague, Dr. Harpreet Singh, who is an oncologist who's been in the evidence accelerator, really making sure that cancer patients' voices are also heard and getting some information about how patients with cancer are affected by COVID-19 diagnoses. I guess I'll close by saying we have, a lot to learn right now, and we have the opportunity to learn especially about decentralized trials. We've reached out to companies who have deployed these in existing trials to understand what their outcomes look like before they deployed the modifications and what their outcomes may look like during these modifications, so we can make science-based decisions on how to prioritize which of these remote assessments to move forward with in all of our collective hopes to start to decentralize trials more. So I'll end there, and I really look forward to the discussion. Thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you, Paul. And as an oncology nurse practitioner, when I hear you talk about symptom and function and those outcomes, that's always very exciting to me to understand that patient experience. And I did want to do a shout out for the FDA. I think Amy mentioned yesterday the new Office of Digital Health Experience being formed at the FDA sometime in 2020. So a very timely response to the issues we're talking about now and that are becoming part of healthcare. Thank you. I'm going to move on now to Dr. Mia Levy. So Mia is the Sheba Foundation Director. You've seen her speak a couple times already. Mia, I hope we haven't burnt you out yet. It's always wonderful to have you on the forum and speaking at these workshops. She's the Sheba Foundation Director of the Cancer Center at Rush University Medical Center and the System Vice President for Cancer Services at Rush System for Health. She's an associate professor in the Division of Hematology and Oncology and a practicing medical oncologist, specializing in the treatment of breast cancer and precision oncology. Welcome, Dr. Levy.
Thank you, Lisa. And again, this topic for the forum could not have been more timely. I've spoken several times now on the impact of COVID-19 on the acceleration of digital health and cancer. And there are a few closing remarks that I'd like to make in regard to this topic, as well as in response to the other speakers we've heard over the last day and a half. We are at a critical time right now in the life cycle of telehealth. And telehealth had struggled for about 15 years to really take off in this country, largely due to payment models. We are in a moment of time where those payment models have been swept aside for a new model that could result in parity of payment. In order for telehealth to really continue to thrive and succeed in the United States, we are going to need to sustain and really make more robust these policies so that they can be durable. Many health institutions are still very cautious with telehealth because they don't have a clear guidance from payers, whether they're the CMS or private payers, as to whether or not telehealth will be continuing on post the next several weeks, frankly, for many of the payers. And this has led to where we had a very rapid adoption at the beginning of the pandemic to a rolling back of the use of telehealth services, really at a critical time when we are experiencing yet another surge in the United States, especially in the southern states. And this is a very concerning transition period, because we really don't have the policy backing to move all of this forward. And there's so much variation in both state and federal and private payer state level regulation around this that it is becoming difficult to navigate as a healthcare system. So the policy components really, with respect to the parity of payment, really need to be at the forefront of solutions in the urgent next several weeks to several months if we are going to see this these natural experiments which we've done succeed to be durable, which I believe patients and healthcare systems really want to see happen. In addition to the parity of payment, we discussed the lack of ability to do consultations across state lines with respect to laws related to licensure for physicians providing second opinions to patients who currently reside in another state when they're receiving their referral. This will continue to limit cancer patient access to high quality second opinions, which are essential components to the successful management of patients with cancer. And at a time when patients are hesitant, and rightly so, from traveling by air or even by long distances by vehicle to get that second opinion, the ability to provide these consultations across state lines cannot be understated. Furthermore, if we are to see, which we all hope, that telehealth in oncology continues to be part of our practice, we will need to evolve into creation of best practice guidelines on the appropriate use of telehealth for cancer patients, as well as develop specific strategies to evaluate the efficacy of telehealth in those various scenarios. And finally, I just want to put the final plug in. I believe that the last two technologies that are ripe beyond telehealth for digital health implementations include patient-reported outcomes and remote monitoring. These two other components are the most ripe for further adoption. But again, we need good incentive alignments because these are complicated economic models. And it is unclear who the real customer is, the buyer is, and the user are of these systems in order to make them sustainable moving forward. So I'll thank you again for your time and the National Cancer Policy Forum for bringing these important issues to light at this extraordinary time in our country.
Thank you, Mia. Those are certainly timely comments. And, you talk about the best practices for telehealth. We kind of jumped in and didn't actually think about triaging, who's the most appropriate patient to be seen face-to-face, and how those best practices are going to emerge with the evidence we see from outcomes. So a lot more to discuss there. Thank you. Our next speaker this morning is Neal Meropol, who you've already heard from in this panel today. And I'll just quickly reintroduce Neal. He's a medical oncologist and clinical investigator and outcomes researcher, and serves as vice president and head of medical and scientific affairs at Flatiron Health. In his role, he leads efforts and engages partners to leverage Flatiron's technology platforms and provider network to gain insights from real-world data that accelerate research and improve the quality of care for patients. Neal, thank you. Dr. Meropol, welcome.
Thank you so much. And I guess I just want to lead with many thanks to the sponsors of this conference, National Cancer Policy Forum and the Forum on Cyber Resilience. I'm really pleased to have been able to take part. And my comments at this point will be, to some extent, riffing on or reiterating, calling out some of the things that resonated to me over the past couple of days with really a very comprehensive exploration of the topic of the utility and the future direction for digital health applications. One point I would make is there's obviously so much opportunity related to a potential platform for a learning healthcare system, the inputs into that platform involving digital health. And one thing I would say is I don't want us to be sort of overwhelmed or discouraged by the potential in a way which makes it overwhelming. And I think we've heard throughout the past day and a half several examples of specific applications that could benefit patients. And really, that's the way that we're going to get to our end goal, which is identifying specific use cases, data that are fit for those use cases, applications that are appropriately vetted, validated for their reliability for those use cases. And that will lead to adoption as well as stimulate additional innovation when the opportunities are seen. I want to reiterate the importance of having the patient at the center of everything we do related to digital health. And at the same time, we need to recognize all of the important stakeholders, which go beyond what we often in a research realm or patient care realm think of the people you need at the table to make this work. And this really involves regulators, data organizations, technology developers, physicians, and researchers to be working together towards shared goals. In the last session, I made a comment about the involvement of payers in digital health application development and implementation and the importance. And I do want to underscore that importance because this is one of those settings where the customer, in terms of who's paying for a digital health application, may be different than the users or who they're benefiting. So you have a patient who may be a direct beneficiary or a user. You may have a physician who's a user of a digital health application, is interacting directly with it, but neither of those groups may actually be willing to pay for that application. And it may be that the payers will, whether it's CMS as a government payer or private payers, may have the incentives to incentivize use of digital health applications. So I did want to call that out. And then finally, I just wanted to make a point about falling in love with your children. And that we all think our children are perfect. I mean, my children are perfect for sure. But we have to be willing to listen to the users of our products that we're developing to make sure that they resonate. So I've been guilty myself of latching on to an idea and being resistant to letting it go or iterating on it. But the fact is, when we're building digital applications, we got to be able to see the flaws in our children, and we got to be able to work with others to develop products and tools that are actually felt to be valuable by the people who will either use them or pay for them, practically speaking. So I'll leave it at that.
Those are great comments. And certainly we're moving quickly. And sometimes I think we are creating what we think is going to be the perfect product. But these are all 1.0s right now, aren't they? As we're moving so fast to create what we think is to fill the need, particularly during a pandemic. Thank you, Neal. Our next speaker this morning is Susan Peterson. Susan's a professor of behavioral science at MD Anderson Cancer Center, and you may have been lucky enough to hear her speak yesterday. Her research focuses on psychosocial and behavioral outcomes of genetic testing for hereditary cancer syndromes in cancer survivors and their families, as well as the integration of genetic services into general oncology care. Dr. Peterson also leads the development and evaluation of novel sensor-based and mobile technology applications for behavioral assessment and intervention. Dr. Peterson.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I wanted to say thanks also to the sponsors of this terrific forum and also to all the speakers for your excellent and thought-provoking presentations yesterday and today. They all highlighted very important progress that's been made in many areas, but also have noted where more work is needed. And I really liked Neal's remarks about building on and focusing on the patient in all of our endeavors, and wanted to just reflect on some thoughts from yesterday's presentations on patient-facing technologies, both from our session as well as the ones that were interspersed throughout the day. I think a consistent theme that ran through many of the talks yesterday that discussed the successful applications of patient-facing technology highlighted the importance of really keeping the key stakeholders' perspectives in mind. Certainly that's the patients, but also the providers and the number of other stakeholders that have been mentioned previously that I won't repeat. And it's important to kind of keep these perspectives in mind in ongoing implementation and the overall lifespan of these digital interventions. And I also liked Neal's remarks about loving your children and not wanting to let them go, and recognizing that the lifespan of these interventions does have a 1.0 and a 2.0, and we need certainly to be cognizant of that and the need to continually evolve. So this, I think this really, the importance is really to engage patients, caregivers, and providers and others throughout the design and implementation process to make sure that whatever's created reflects the priorities and the preferences which may shift, as well as cultural perspectives. And I use the term cultural very broadly to reflect all groups. And I think the interventions that we saw that show successful outcomes all had incorporated these methods to gather input from patients and providers, very deliberate, thoughtful methods at various points throughout the development and the implementation process. And several speakers discussed the need to pay close attention to patient engagement, as well as provider engagement, as ongoing process outcome targets, which includes continually revisiting the value proposition for all groups. For patients, this was shown to include sharing data and feedback that was viewed as valued and important to their care. And I think one group that might not have been mentioned deliberately, but is important to consider, are caregivers. They're important to include in this equation as well. And our own work has found that caregivers derive value from the digital interventions that are provided to patients. I think another theme that emerged was the need to build the evidence base. And we have seen examples of interventions that have shown efficacy, such as collecting and intervening on electronic patient-reported outcomes, which now need to move more broadly into implementation. And then there's also a need, as was mentioned previously, to identify new use cases in oncology in order to continue to build the evidence base on how digital health can be used to improve outcomes in cancer. And perhaps this global pandemic might have sharply illuminated some of these use cases, and we need to leverage some of these opportunities. An example is how patient-facing technologies can support the delivery of telehealth, for example, as Mia aptly had described in a couple of her presentations yesterday. So with the tremendous potential for digital health to transform cancer care and prevention, we also need to address the disparities in access to these technologies, both with regard to patients' personal access and their digital health literacy, which is now another construct we need to consider on top of health literacy, as well as healthcare settings' ability to adopt and utilize these technologies. And this is a broad topic. I could spend probably half an hour on this, but it's critical because there's a potential to create greater disparities within the groups who might actually benefit the most from digital health. So finally, as several have touched on, a critical challenge and barriers in this endeavor is financial. And it ranges from a lack of clear business models, issues regarding workflow and staffing, and also infrastructure support for the implementation of these technologies, as well as reimbursement for digital health services. So with that, I'll close and say thank you very much for this opportunity to share some final thoughts on how to move forward in this exciting and innovative area. Lisa?
Thank you, Susan. Well, that was a lot of information. And I think as we found in our planning call, we could have kept going for a lot longer, as you allude to. You know, the value proposition is extremely important in understanding not just how we collect data, but maybe how we deliver interventions as well. And I think behavioral health, it might be one of those areas where interventions can be delivered to patients digitally as well. But you know, that lack of access, that lack of tech savviness may actually create greater disparity. So let's kind of keep that thought, and we're going to move on to our last speaker, and then we'll have an opportunity for discussion. And also, I wanted to let the audience know, of course, that you can put questions in the Q&A box, and our staff will be feeding those to me. So our final speaker this morning, before we begin the question and answer session, is Lara Strawbridge. Welcome, Lara. Lara is the director of the Division of Ambulatory Payment Models in the Patient Care Models Group in the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. In this role, Ms. Strawbridge leads CMS's efforts on physician specialty models, such as the oncology care model and the proposed radiation oncology model and Part B drug issues. So I'd like to welcome Lara to the panel today.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate being included today. The perspective that I'll represent this morning is really something that we haven't heard yet in the workshop, which is really from the payer side. And as you said, specifically alternative payment models that are seeking to transform and improve cancer care at reduced costs. I really appreciate the discussions over the past day and a half. They've been rich and provocative. And based on them, I have basically 5 critical questions for us to consider, really related specifically to ePros, to big data, and also telehealth, and as we think about integrating those in alternative payment models. So first, we've been thinking about ePros and whether or not they should be included in a future oncology model. We put out an informal RFI for an oncology care first model last fall. And as we've heard in this workshop, there's some really exciting research in this area. They offer the opportunity to involve patients in decision-making and care management, to give clinicians new information at the point of care and potentially to improve outcomes. So my first critical question really is, how do we integrate ePros in workflows and ensure that the information is acted on? We've learned from the oncology care model, OCM, that seamless integration of information in workflows is really hard work, and it can be resource intensive. And you need buy-in from the full care team, so the oncologist, the nurse, and the patient. And in OCM, we've also heard repeatedly about the challenges of using technologies that don't sync well with the EHR. So let's think about big data too. ePros and other digital health tools can all be information that flows into a big data set that can be used for quality improvement. So how can we use artificial intelligence, integrate many different data streams to inform care, and also, as Dr. Parekh acknowledged yesterday, ensure that we only put the most critical information in front of the clinician. We want to make sure they aren't overwhelmed and we're not just creating more boxes for them to click. I also want to point out there's a range of practice readiness out there. In OCM, we have a heterogeneous group of practices, and we provide a wealth of claims data to those who participate. And we hear everything from help, I really don't know how to even open these data, let alone use them, to give me more data, more, faster, faster, faster. So a second critical question really is, what platforms and methods of integrating and sharing data with a range of clinicians are going to be least burdensome and then also most actionable? A third related, and perhaps I think my most critical question, is how should payment work? Ethan Bash yesterday suggested maybe there should be individual payments for the use of digital health technologies like ePros. Alternatively, in a value-based payment model, we might think that capitated payments or total cost of care responsibility may in and of itself provide sufficient incentive to manage care, that clinicians will adopt tools like ePros on their own in order to perform better under the model. So another way of saying this is, how much flexibility really should we provide to let clinicians have the resources they need to provide the best care versus the need for us to dictate through a payment model what is required to ensure that everyone participating is meeting a certain standard or aligning with evidence-based care. A related question here is, should we consider using performance on ePros to affect value-based payments? And if so, work needs to be done to ensure that any results from the pros are valid and reliable as a measure of quality. And then lastly, telehealth. So as described by many others, and we've seen lightning speed adoption, which has been exciting and interesting. And many folks have started talking about wanting to extend the flexibilities around who can do telehealth, where can they do it, and how much payment they get, as Mia was describing a few minutes ago. It's possible that the flexibilities will be extended beyond the public health emergency, potentially by Congress or by CMS. But if not, alternative payment models like a future oncology model could potentially offer waivers to allow telehealth to continue in a more flexible way. So I have two critical questions here to wrap up my comments. One is which visits should be telehealth versus in person, and Mia's talked about this already, but understanding which care should happen in which setting and what is the impact of using telehealth on outcomes. So the public health emergency, I think, will help us learn what care is right for telehealth, what isn't. And we also need to, as many speakers have talked about, think about opportunities to ensure disparities aren't exacerbated. So my final parting question for everyone really is, as we think about the design of future oncology models, which I spend my days doing, how might cancer care be permanently changed by COVID-19? We've been asking this question a lot of many of you that are on attending the workshop today, but really would appreciate any input folks have related not just to telehealth, but also more broadly. How is COVID-19 causing you as a clinician to reevaluate the timing, the frequency, the amount of care that is provided to your patients in ways that we should consider potentially promoting in a future model? So thanks again for letting me participate and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Laura. You're doing my job for me, and I appreciate that. That was my first question, and I think when we certainly started planning this a year ago, we had no idea what was going to happen this year, and we had to really pivot quickly in planning this meeting this spring. And I think I'd like to start with that. Actually, what lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic, the changes in practice, are going to be the sort of changes that we want to maintain, that have durability, that have impact. And I open that up to the whole panel.
May I start?
Yes, ma'am.
Laura, I really appreciate that question. And it's not about digital health for a moment here. But two things that we would have really loved to have implemented as part of our mitigation strategy for keeping patients safe during COVID-19 was a more scalable version of home lab draws, which is one of the main barriers to being able to really do telehealth fully if you want to try to keep the patient out of having to come to a medical center. You obviously can do a blood draw and then do a telehealth appointment, which we did. We decoupled those, but if patients coming in anyway. And then second was home infusion. So there's many restrictions on home infusion. Now, granted, this is a loaded statement because as a healthcare system, we make a lot of our money by administering infusions in our infusion centers, and that's a main source of revenue. But the number of cancer drugs that can currently be administered at home is very restricted. I do believe CMS has just come up with some new guidance in this regard for home infusions, but a more aggressive look at those that have a low infusion reaction profiles would be very welcome.
Yeah, great comments. Other people, what would you not want to see go away post-COVID?
Because I can jump in just from the clinical trial setting. It's instructive to reiterate and remind everyone the different lens that the different people are seeing through. We have clinical care, and Mia's really concentrated on how can we just look at individual patients. And in the clinical trial setting, we're focused on patient safety first and foremost, which is also what Mia's focused on, but we're also very focused on the integrity of the trial and the data that can answer the questions for why it's being deployed. So there's like another layer that we have to think about in the clinical trial setting, which is if we're just going to let's just take home imaging not in the home, but imaging in the local area, just a regular local radiologist versus your Memorial Sloan Kettering, set of radiologists who read that site's scans. We don't know the kind of variability that's going to be instilled in data integrity when you do that. They may have not scanned below the portion where we say this is an interpretable scan. They may have done it outside of the window at which we want to have the scans done. So there's a lot of variability that could be instilled. That's one of the things. So if I could think of the things that will be critical for decentralized trials, it would be, what is the variability that you're going to instill for getting labs and imaging in your local area and telehealth for adverse event reporting? that is acceptable, because obviously it would be incredibly beneficial to patients to not have to travel hundreds of miles to the clinical care site. In some cases, hundreds of miles to the site where the trial is accruing.
And Paul, even for some therapeutic interventional studies, home infusion could be appropriate as well. That would be the true definition of a distributed trial if they didn't have to come hundreds of miles to actually get the therapy itself.
Yeah, and even outside the context of a clinical trial, when you're talking about real-world data, this has forced us to think critically about what we collect when we're actually in person with a physician, and the quality of each variable and its reliability that we collect when we're not face-to-face with the physician or the healthcare provider. I know as a patient myself, because I'm of a certain age, so I get my blood pressure checked. I've been loving COVID in terms of the telehealth opportunity. When I used to have to take a half a day out of work for a 15-minute appointment to have my prescriptions filled, now it is like clockwork. I log in, the doctor's there, we get done what we need to get done, and I'm back at my computer, back at work, in my office here. That's really terrific. And it's made me think, well, what benefits would I have gotten if I was in person? Well, I can take my blood pressure at home. I have a friend who's an OB who said that all her patients have been sent blood pressure cuffs, so they don't have to come in. The only thing I need to show up for is to have my blood drawn, provided that I don't have some need for a physical examination. But it's going to make us think about things like, how important is the physical exam? Why is it important? In what settings? I think this is a huge opportunity for us to think about healthcare delivery writ large in the wake of the pandemic.
Yeah, Neal, you're certainly putting out all kinds of use cases there. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I did want to say we have some questions. I have one for Paul here. What steps do you think should be taken when implementing PROs in clinical practice for clinical care in order to enable those data to be usable for regulatory purposes?
Well, I think it has to do with what the regulatory question is you're asking. Like everything, we were just talking about purpose. I was bringing up the idea that the purpose will drive how you collect the data and what sort of level you need to be collecting that. But regardless, I would say that the first thing you'd want to do, which I kind of mentioned in my introductory comments, is to, where possible, select the tool, the actual electronic patient-reported outcome tool that has been developed for use in clinical trials. Because I guess to Neal's point about everyone loves their children, a lot of companies have developed questionnaires that are sort of on face make a lot of sense. They ask the questions that kind of make sense, and they pick some responses. But what needs to be understood in that community is the rigor and the time that goes into developing a patient-reported outcome instrument and testing that, and then translating it into the number of languages that need to be translated into. It's a heavy lift if you want it to be quantify these outcomes and to be able to use them rigorously to, say, compare two populations. So I guess I would say that number one is tools. Like, you really want to, that's why if we can talk, and I've discussed with people across stakeholder communities, CMS, some of the real world data folks, let's use tools that are good for trials if they meet the needs of the clinicians and the patients. And in most cases, there's a lot of overlap. So I would say tools is number one.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. I have another question for everyone. I'm involved in interprofessional education, design, and delivery for health professional students, including students of medicine, nursing, dental medicine, pharmacy, and social work. I'd appreciate suggestions from the panelists as to which key concepts associated with oncology digital health applications would be most relevant and actionable in the interprofessional educational setting. It's a good question, isn't it? Because now we're moving into what do we have to include as part of pre-professional education?
So I mentioned in my telehealth presentation that we actually had to work pretty hard to be able to get multiple users on our telehealth applications during our implementation. So for the video visit component, and we were able to allow trainees to be on the line. We were able to allow translators and the research coordinator, the patient, as well as another family member who may have been in at another location. So exposing students to the practice of telehealth will become essential. But I do believe that we might need some best practices in education, even for established physicians and providers, because this is a new age, and there's new opportunities for how we will be training our future generation to work within this context. I wanted to add one other point, which I think is also important. It was suggested on a sort of side conversation yesterday that what if telehealth becomes the way in which we now video record the consultative component of an appointment with a patient and no longer need to do our documentation as we have previously done, if that can become the permanent record. So imagine now practicing an environment like that. Imagine the future of our students and ourselves, that we need to train ourselves to understand that this encounter is going to be recorded permanently, and the components that you need to cover in order for medical legal purposes and appropriate engagement in a setting like this.
Yeah, a great opportunity. Less documentation too.
Or a shift in documentation towards some of the challenges that were mentioned earlier on the minimal patient model. If you no longer need to write the entire prose of your consultation because that's already been recorded, perhaps you can just focus on the key elements that are needed in order to facilitate a learning system, for instance.
I think that concentration on incentives is just exactly what Mia is talking about there. What an incredible incentive that could be. Equally, and I've seen this happen at my dermatology appointment, is you can have a review of systems electronically given to a patient based with patient-reported outcomes. And everyone who's a clinician right now knows about review of systems and how it relates to billing. If that would also be taken care of through patient-reported outcomes, you'd have, another potential incentive. In fact, that's been discussed a little bit about how maybe ePro would be more embraced by the clinical community.
Yeah. I do have a question for Lara. You ready, Lara? Okay.
I'm ready.
Regardless of COVID, virtual care is preferable for many patients. However, virtual visits appear to require about 40% more staff time to tee up the patient, to do remote med reconciliation, tech help, etc. Moreover, the practice's facility fee is lost. How can reimbursement align to incentivize practices to continue delivering virtual care?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks. I think one question that I would pose out there is I think it's probably unclear so far, given that we are still in a relatively early stage of seeing broad implementation of telehealth, is whether that increased time is really something that would continue over time as the platforms get better, as staff get more used to using them, et cetera. I also would point out, I think what we've heard in testing the oncology care model, where we make a payment for enhanced services, where we cover things like 24/7 access to a clinician, where some things may be happening in a virtual space, is that we've given a little bit more flexibility to folks to have some payment that covers things that weren't traditionally paid before. And so, if you were already as a clinician on the phone with your patient, is an enhanced services payment something that you could use to cover those kinds of resource and cost investments? Is that the best way to support delivery of telehealth, and then also other kinds of, innovative or creative approaches to managing the patient's care? I think we don't know yet what the best way to pay for it is. is continuing to rely on fee-for-service, not just for the in-person visits, but telehealth the best way. I think one of the exciting things to come out of COVID has been a renewed commitment to doing value-based care and a recognition that participating in value care models can make you more ready to face challenges like COVID. And so how do we potentially test alternatives, which I mentioned in my remarks earlier? Is a capitated payment a better way to approach things where you can really do telehealth or in-person or whatever care is needed for the patient? Or is a total cost of care responsibility where you see some, performance-based payments if you're providing care through telehealth, which might be less costly than the in-person visits where it's appropriate, an incentive for you there. I think we have a lot of questions in this space, and it's something that we're eager to talk with folks more about and think about how we can test in the future.
Yeah, a great point. And I often bring up, too, that nurses have been doing telehealth for decades, following patients after they have their first treatment, following up on symptoms, following up because they have a sense that maybe something isn't right, when they saw the patient in person the day before. So I think nurses have a lot of expertise in telehealth, and I'm going to put forward my profession as a group that can be very informative about what some best practices might be. So just my little plug there. I do have one more question for Elisabeth, and that's going to be our last question because, believe it or not, we're almost done. Elisabeth, your question is, in addition to privacy and security compliance, what other legal and regulatory issues should providers be aware with the increasing use of telehealth?
Thanks, Lisa. Many licensing boards have specific and detailed rules relating to telehealth, and the clinicians need to understand and comply with these rules. For example, the licensing regulations often contain specific requirements relating to patient-informed consent for telehealth encounters, which go beyond the requirements of usual informed consent in inpatient settings. Secondly, the clinician involved should be sure that he or she acts consistent with the standard of care under the terms of his or her license and consistent with the standard, and that they would employ for in-person treatments and the clinician's specialty area. Third, it's critically important to document the telehealth encounter appropriately in the electronic health record. Some EHRs have technology that makes this easy, but where that technology doesn't exist, then the physician should ensure that there is a separate encounter detailed. Additionally, certain clinicians, such as physicians, cannot treat a patient via telehealth located in a state where they are not licensed to practice medicine. And in the age of Zoom, it's easy for a clinician to think, oh, even if my patient is located out of state, I can Zoom with that patient and have a telehealth encounter. Again, if the physician is not licensed in that jurisdiction, that can be problematic. And last, certain conditions may not be appropriately diagnosed and or treated via telemedicine, and the clinician involved in the telehealth encounter will need to recognize such conditions and arrange for appropriate in-person diagnosis and treatment if the telehealth encounter is not appropriate.
Elisabeth, thank you. That is quite a bit of information, and some of that new to me. So I'm going to guess that maybe some others are also thinking, boy, we're going to start to need the manual, and at the moment, a state-by-state manual, and hopefully some federal regulations about what the policies and the regulation and the regulatory issues are going to be about use of telehealth, and probably in addition, digital health applications. I wish we had more time. This is a fantastic panel. Thank you all, Elisabeth, Paul, Mia, Neal, and Susan, and Lara. I could keep going a lot longer with all of you. I really welcome your participation. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to turn this over now to Larry.